Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak to people who probably don't need this tutorial, but I'm excited to give it. I'm excited to give it anyway. I'm going to talk about inclusive fitness. Is this what I use? Did you use that? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to just have to poke as well. I want to start by talking about the movie Jaws. There's a scene in the movie Jaws that I absolutely love, and it involves Richard Dreyfuss's character, Matt Hooper, a shark expert, trying to convince the mayor of Amity Island to shut down the beach during the busy season to prevent a shark attack. And Matt Hooper says to the mayor, Mr. Vaughn, what we are dealing with, I'm going to try to capture this. What we are dealing with here is a perfect engine, an eating machine, referring to the shark, okay? An eating machine. It's really a miracle of evolution. All this machine does is swim and eat and make little sharks. And that's all. I love that scene. I love that scene because it reminds me of the power behind the heuristic of fitness maximization, how it can help us very quickly make sense of adaptation, right? So we can, if we're thinking about, there's a little lag on here, sorry. If we're thinking about a great white shark, we can use fitness maximization like Matt Hooper did to understand intuitively why the shark's teeth are sharp. Right? Having sharp teeth makes the shark able to have baby sharks. And we can, how did you describe it this morning, Manus? You talked about the trait, that behavior that an individual wields, right? And so we can trace back the consequences to the shark that is wielding the sharp teeth. Fitness maximization also helps us understand intuitively why a hummingbird's bill is slender. It helps us intuitively understand why a leaf insect is camouflaged. Fitness maximization alone, however, makes it more difficult, or maybe it's difficult to use fitness maximization when you're trying to understand the adaptive significance of social behavior, because it's harder to trace back to behaviors wielded by an individual if you're trying to understand individual level adaptation. So I think of inclusive fitness as a way or as a solution to resolving the weirdness associated with social behavior. Inclusive fitness gives us a maximand that allows us to easily understand at a heuristic level why a particular social behavior, maybe like altruism, is adaptive. At least it traces back to adaptation at an individual level. I've got two main goals with my tutorial today, and I've got a third that I hope to get to. The first goal that I want to accomplish is define for you inclusive fitness, and I'm going to focus on Hamilton's original 1964 definition. We're going to explore it over a few slides. The second of my goals involves discussing some work very briefly that I accomplished with Tom Scott here, and that is using an idea, specifically the idea of conservation of reproductive value, and we'll get into what reproductive value is and how we're conserving it, to model mathematically inclusive fitness. And finally, and this is something that I hope to get to if there's time left, that's why it's outside the box, and it's going to be a little bit of editorializing on my part. All the things that I wanted to tell you about that I just couldn't get in the first couple of items. Okay. Hopefully it won't be a little too much of a fire hose, but we will see. So let's start with the definition of inclusive fitness as understood by Hamilton in his 1964 work. To build up this definition, I'm going to ask you to consider what I'll call for now a symmetric social interaction. I'll probably have to adjust exactly what I mean by symmetric as I go through the talk, but basically I'm thinking about some baseline scenario where I have two individuals. I'm going to label one the actor for convenience and the other recipient for convenience, and these individuals interact with one another and influence each other's reproductive success. And I'm going to use W bar. I think Maria would have used W sub 0 a moment ago, okay? But this is just a baseline scenario. The two individuals are related by a factor of R. Now, one individual, the actor, decides or carries an allele that makes the decision for them, decides to alter its behavior. It decides to alter its behavior in a way that reduces its own reproductive success, I'll say by a factor C. Okay, and at the same time, it improves the reproductive success of the recipient, its social partner, by B. Okay, so we're in a situation where we've got W bar minus C on one side and W bar plus B on the other. At this point, we're ready to define mathematically the blue individual, the actor's inclusive fitness. And I'm going to define it as W bar minus a blue C plus the relatedness coefficient multiplied by a blue B. And I'm coloring these things blue because I'm tracing them back to the individual who expressed the behavior, right? I think we saw behavior in the previous slide, or previous talk, sorry. Now, that's not the only thing that can be going on in this symmetric social situation. Okay, an individual who makes this deviant decision might be making this deviant decision because it carries an allele that kind of determines that, and individuals just around that blue individual may also carry that same allele, and so there may be other deviant behaviors locally that play into exactly how much reproductive success everyone has. So we could imagine there's some chance that the red individual, the individual I've called the recipient, red for recipient, I guess, makes a similarly deviant decision and reduces its own fitness by C, and now I'm saying red C, and improves the fitness, the reproductive success of the blue actor by red B. Okay? The red B and C do not come into the individual's inclusive fitness. Okay? They're not a part of it. I'm mentioning that because these kind of symmetric situations can lead to a lot of confusion when we start talking about inclusive fitness, especially if you're used to thinking about inclusive fitness more loosely, right? In particular, inclusive fitness is not, and I've written this down at the bottom of the slide here, inclusive fitness is not the blue individual's entire reproductive success plus a relatedness coefficient multiplied by the red individual's total reproductive success, right? I think Alan Graffin had dismissed that definition of inclusive fitness. He called it the simple weighted sum. Inclusive fitness is not that. It's sometimes sold in undergraduate classes as that, but it's not. It's also not the blue individual, the actor's reproductive success, entire reproductive success, plus the relatedness weighted benefit it generates in its neighbors. It is not that. I think that definition was tried out by E.O. Wilson, I think in sociobiology in 1975. Again, there's a nice piece of work by Alan Graffin that shows how that leads to errors. And you can actually maybe pick up the error in here. It double counts the benefit, right? So we have a red benefit kicking around, and we've credited the particular social behavior with too much benefit in that case. Okay, so inclusive fitness is just what you see there in the middle of the slide, a baseline or average fitness plus a blue B, plus relatedness times a blue B minus a blue C. So now that we've gone through that picture, let's hear from Hamilton about how he defined inclusive fitness in 1964. I like to start with that picture because Hamilton's 1964 definition is a lot to take in. If you've ever tried to read it, at least the first few times you read it, it's quite baffling. Hamilton asks us to focus on the production of adult offspring. You can generalize this to reproductive success and survival, but we'll just go with his definition. He asks us to focus on production of adult offspring. And so that there from the previous slide is the blue individual's production of adult offspring. Okay. Then Hamilton asks us to augment by any harms and benefits experienced by the neighbors attributed to the blue individual weighted by R. By that, I think in terms of our previous slide, that's just saying add on the R times the blue B. Okay, there might be a more general situation where you've got harms and benefits, but the simple picture I just presented just had benefits. And now this is where things get a little bit confusing for folks, because Hamilton asks us to now strip this quantity of the harms and benefits inflicted upon the blue individual by other or parenthetically red individuals in that particular actor's social environment. Okay, so what we're stripping here is that piece, the red B. What we are not stripping is all social effects on inclusive fitness. We are not stripping that. We are stripping just kind of the weirdness associated with the blue individual social environment from our expression. Okay? In particular, this W bar still includes all the baseline social environmental effects. Okay? That's key. And in fact, I think not recognizing that has led to some confusion in the recent literature. Inclusive fitness isn't, of course, Hamilton's rule. Hamilton's rule that tells us when a social behavior is, or say a costly social behavior for an individual is favored by selection. It's not inclusive fitness, but it is related to inclusive fitness, right? So we could take an individual's inclusive fitness and see how that inclusive fitness fares against the average reproductive success in the population, right? We would subtract the W bar from the expression. What we're left with, I guess, is termed the inclusive fitness effect. If that inclusive fitness effect is positive, then again, following Hamilton's rule, the particular social behavior, the one that costs the blue individual C and benefits its related neighbor by blue B, that if that's positive, then selection is favored the trait. Okay, so that in a nutshell, I guess that in a nutshell is inclusive fitness in terms of a definition. To preface the second part of my tutorial, I want to return to this particular slide. I want to then point out, I mean, I guess I could tie into Maria's talk that there's a connection between inclusive fitness and say the price equation related decompositions presented in the previous talk. There is a slight difference between what I'm trying to sell you and what we saw in the previous talk. In particular, I think what we saw in the previous talk is connected to inclusive fitness, but it is not exactly inclusive fitness. I'm going to offer that what Maria described for us is neighbor modulated fitness, right? Maria swapped in a red B where I have a blue B. Okay, that's mathematically, if we have the symmetry that I'm describing, we're okay. We can still arrive at the same conclusions that we would have by studying, say, inclusive fitness or the inclusive fitness effect, but it's not strictly speaking the same. I mention this also because perhaps ironically, thinking about neighbor modulated fitness is the major way many of us study mathematically inclusive fitness, right? Thanks to, I think Steve and Peter Taylor have an amazing paper. I think it was a game-changing paper in 1996 that gave us a set of tools, maybe, for lack of a better term, an algorithm to come up with what is mathematically equivalent to the inclusive fitness effect by thinking about neighbor modulated fitness. I've always found it a bit weird that that is the way that we get to inclusive fitness by thinking about something that isn't inclusive fitness. But it works, and it's super helpful. It's super helpful, but it does require you to engage in a little bit of mental gymnastics, right? You have to flip perspectives, right? This is all recipient centered. This is all recipient centered effects. You have to think about, and I think Maria did a great job interpreting the relatedness coefficient in this context for us. I'm kind of talking about it as a correlation, but we were just, I think, correctly told that it was, you can also think about it as a regression coefficient, right? Maybe what I'll say is it's focusing our attention on the red individual when really we want to think about the blue, okay? And it can also end up, and I guess you're just going to have to take my word for it, it can also make things a little bit awkward, lead to inadvertent double counting. All of these observations about maybe the irony of studying inclusive fitness using this neighbor modulated fitness approach, those motivated Tom and I to think of a different way of getting an inclusive fitness in a more direct sense, right? We wanted to maybe even dispel the sense that, or the sense that having to get inclusive fitness through this suggested that neighbor modulated fitness was somehow more fundamental. And to do that, and this is the second part of my presentation, to do that, Tom and I centered our thinking around something called reproductive value. Okay, so reproductive value, if you're not familiar with it, reflects an individual's contribution to the gene pool in the very distant future. Okay, so I mean, for my money, it is the true measure of individuals' evolutionary success. And we also exploited the fact that evolutionary success, defined as reproductive value, means that it is a zero-sum game. That is to say, I can't have more than 100%. I can't sort of be ancestor to more than 100% of the gene pool in the distant future. And if there is a gene pool in the distant future, some collection of us has to be the ancestor, right? So I can't have more than 100%, and we have to get to 100%, right? The implication there is that if I increase my share of the gene pool in the distant future, then some other set of individuals their share has to shrink to compensate. Okay, and if I shrink my share, then other people can step into that void and take more. Okay, so we use this idea that reproductive value is conserved. We separated social interactions into, or we conceived of social interactions as having a primary effect, right? I pay a cost, I give man as a benefit. And secondary effects, all the shifts in individual slices, individual shares of the gene pool in the distant future. We put those together to come up with a modeling paradigm that helps maybe avoid, if one is want to do that, avoid going at inclusive fitness from a neighbor modulated or direct fitness route. Okay, so it's all about an individual share. I'm going to put up pictures like this. This circle represents the total reproductive value of the population, so the 100% of the ownership of the gene pool in the distant future, and then I'm going to subdivide it into individual shares or some shares of collections of individuals. To illustrate how one goes about using the ideas that Tom and I were selling, I'm going to refer to I think a well-studied example. This is from work by Peter Taylor in evolutionary ecology, not evolutionary ecology research, but evolutionary ecology in 1992. Peter asks us to think of an asexual population arranged into groups. I have broken the mold here. My groups are rounded. My groups are rounded, dashed. So I'm not like ovals are so passe. Just for simplicity, I'm going to assume that my individuals occur in groups of size 2. Now, these individuals, like I said, they're haploid, they're asexual, and they undergo a life cycle. A life cycle that I'm going to begin at 9 o'clock. So social partners, individuals in the same group, they interact, and there's a primary interaction there. So one of them will pay a cost C and give a fitness benefit B to its partner, and possibly vice versa, right? Then after the interaction at noon, each partner produces its own offspring. And I'm going to represent offspring. I mean, I should have used W, but I'm going to use F for fecundity here. And then the partners will die. So everything that's left just past the stroke of noon is offspring produced by the parental generation. I'm going to then allow at 3 o'clock partial dispersal of offspring. I'm using migration M or mixing parameter M to describe how much dispersal goes on. So if M is 1, then we have a well-mixed population. And if M tends towards 0, then we have more group isolation. That M, the level of mixing, among other things, will determine the relatedness between the social partners in the group. I don't think I'm going to tell you exactly how you calculate that, but it's not particularly exciting, but you can do it. Okay. At 6 o'clock, offspring, all the offspring after dispersal, they will compete for the spots vacated by the now dead parents. That competition will occur. Unsuccessful competitors will die, and we'll start again the next day at 9 o'clock. Okay. So the way Tom and I were thinking about this, in fact, I mean, I have to give credit where credit's due, that this is also the way Peter describes things in his 1992 paper. Although he may not have talked about slices of pie, but it's effectively the same thing, is as follows. Okay, so I want to focus first on the primary interaction. And I'm going to start with a baseline scenario over here on the left, where every individual has an equal share of the pizza or the pie, or the pizza pie. And F is connected to the size of that share. Okay, that's like baseline. That's like playing the role of my W bar in my previous slides. The actor comes along, gets this bright idea to then change the slice of its pie by a multiplicative factor C. So it's a reduction. So I'm going to capture C by a change in the absolute fecundity, delta F, divided by F. So I'm thinking in terms of changes in relative fitness here. The deltas I put in to remind me, to tell you that I'm thinking about small phenotypic changes, effectively my version of weak selection. And weak selection, I think we saw in the previous talk, is also important when we're thinking about relatedness. There is, speaking of relatedness, there is a relatedness between the individual who gets this bright idea and the individual who is on the receiving end of the bright idea. So yeah, there's a cost associated with this act, but there's a benefit as well. And the benefit, at least in absolute terms, is going to be represented by delta F2, a small improvement in the fecundity of the neighbor. And when I normalize that, I get this ratio B. That's going to be my benefit. Man, that's bright. Man, I was talking about the light. I wasn't talking about my idea. Okay, so the result here, at least the result of the primary social interaction, is a net change in the amount of B minus C. Okay, I'm capturing that with what you would maybe typically associate with Hamilton's rule by dropping in the relatedness coefficient. So this is where the zero-sumness of evolutionary success comes into play. Right? We've had these changes in evolutionary success generated by a primary social interaction, and now we've created some space that, well, we either need to create some space by elbowing folks out, or we need to allow folks to step in to the space that we would have created. In this case, there's a net change. I said net change of B minus C. So we've got to figure out who pays that price. And who pays that price depends on the assumptions we have made about the details of the life cycle, the 9 a.m. to 9 a.m. the next day, details of the life cycle that we've included in our model. So I'll assume, or based on what I've assumed, be a fraction, 1 minus m, 1 minus that migration rate, stays local to the group. The rest, the m fraction of the B minus C, is exported in terms of competition elsewhere. If you allow me the luxury of assuming that the blue individuals' relatedness to individuals in other groups is 0, or at least the actor is no more related to an individual in another group than it is to the average individual, then I can just disregard that. The actor has no genetic stake, or no greater genetic stake than average on the bit that gets shipped or exported away. The actor does care about the fraction that remains in terms of competition on the local site. So that's the B minus C multiplied by, or weighed, I like that, I'm going to start using weighed, by 1 minus m. And so that B minus C times 1 minus m represents the extra cost, the lost evolutionary success that the actor actually cares about, that's local to its group. And we weight this, now I'm all in my head about that. We weight this by what is effectively the relatedness between the actor and individuals who would have otherwise been able to achieve the success, were it not for the extra B minus C generated. And in this case, this is where, having a very simple two individual model really helps. All I've done is average the individual's relatedness to its own asexual offspring to the asexual offspring of its neighbor, so 1 plus r divided by 2. And then I multiply by an extra 1 minus m, because only a fraction of those offspring actually end up staying and competing locally. Okay, so you can think of this more awkward term as just a different, but the relevant relatedness coefficient to associate with that compensation, that secondary compensation that has to occur. So what we end up with is, well, actually what we ended up with is just this term less the 1. But if we want to talk about inclusive fitness, I have to put back in my W bar. And I'm committed to relative fitness here, right? So you may have said, I expected to see an F there, an F there. But remember, I was dividing through by F, so that becomes a 1. So that's like average relative fitness. And then I tack on, and I've tidied up the term. I've combined those two 1 minus m's, but I get an expression for inclusive fitness that is traced back to the actor, the blue individual, the individual that wields the behavior. And I was able to do that without referencing what I had called neighbor modulated fitness, or the version of inclusive fitness that maybe is suggested by the price equation. Still, because of the symmetry, it's still mathematically equivalent, but conceptually, at least in my books, it's different. Now, I'm emphasizing symmetry, but I think I have to adjust what I define as symmetry, because the pictures that I've been showing so far suggest that I wouldn't necessarily be able to handle a scenario where I've got different kinds of individuals interacting. And okay, this is a little goofy, but maybe I have spectacled individuals interacting with winkers. Okay, in order to pull that off, you're going to make me laugh, Stu. In order to pull that off, just compose myself. Sorry. I'm childish. I'm so childish. I have to have some sort of demographic. I have to have some sort of demographic description of the population, not unlike the demographic situation I had up with the 9-to-9 scenario, but I have to be able to figure out how population dynamics tell me how many spectacled individuals I have versus how many winking individuals I have over time. And as long as I know that there is a typical red recipient and a typical actor, and as long as I know how to make a conversion between the two, so I may know, for instance, that every blue spectacled actor affects three red recipients, and every red recipient is affected by one actor. I can make the conceptual flip between neighbor modulated fitness, the price equation way of thinking about things, and inclusive fitness. I'm good there. Okay, that has to be in place, and maybe I'm making it sound more difficult to ensure that that's in place. It's actually pretty easy as long as you're willing to subdivide and subdivide and subdivide the population till you get it to work. Really, the point I'm trying to make here is that symmetry is a bit more nebulous when we start thinking about different kinds of individuals, but we can still make the conceptual flip we need to move between these two ways of thinking about inclusive fitness. If we have different kinds of individuals, the compensation, the secondary effects, we have to think a bit more carefully about how these secondary effects, the pushing people aside or letting them step into voids in evolutionary success. We have to think a bit differently about how that works. The example that I want to use here is a little less goofy. I want to think about a situation where maybe I have an age-structured population. So I've got individuals, I've got first-year adults, I've got older adults. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that the juveniles, the younger individuals, will help their parents. Okay, so in this particular situation, maybe it's cooperative breeding. Really, the only individuals who are available to be helped are older individuals who have actually had successful broods in the past. Okay, there's a primary social interaction, right? The juveniles will help their parents. There's a C, there's a B, perhaps. But then when it comes time to thinking about the knock-on effects of that primary social interaction, like the secondary compensatory effects, if you want to stay away from neighbor modulated fitness, if you want to stick with inclusive fitness, then one way to do it is to think about total reproductive value. So by total reproductive value, I mean here the reproductive value of an entire group of individuals. And actually, it occurs to me in this moment, if somehow total reproductive value is connected to these fast deer and slow deer, but maybe that's something we could talk about over break. But in this case, I'm thinking about all the reproductive success, all the reproductive value that I might earmark for older adults, and I'll call that C sub A. All the reproductive value I might earmark for first-year adults, I'll call that C sub first. And all the reproductive value, the total reproductive value of juveniles, I'll call that C sub J. Okay? The demographics, whatever I'm going to assume is going on here, is going to tell me what those capital C sub whatevers are. They don't have to remain constant over time. Right? They may, these divisions that I've made may change depending on what the average phenotype is in the population in whatever generation. But at least in the moment, I can think of them as fixed boundaries. And within these fixed boundaries, I start allocating success, say, well, at least in baseline, equally among all the juveniles or equally among all the adults. Okay. So when it comes time to thinking about the secondary effects, who gets pushed out and who gets let in, I think only in terms of within the slice. So if our blue actor were to pay a fitness cost in order to help, then it's shrinking its slice. It's shrinking the slice that I've afforded it in this little, I was going to say quadrant, but it's a trident. This little piece, okay? And who steps in? Who steps into the void created? Other juveniles. The juvenile may give a benefit to the older adult, so it will say, just for argument's sake, maybe increase its slice. And who gets pushed out if I increase that slice? Other adults. Tangentially, this is a factor, or this is related to the fact that what I'm hiding from you is a particular way of normalizing fitness so that the average reproductive success within each group is 1. So there would be, that's why I was thinking about your example, Maria, or sorry, not your example that's not your example. Because there's no within group. In this case, I'm drawing my circles different, or my ovals differently. There's no within group selection, at least in baseline. And actually, now that I say that, there is, and maybe I'm going to undermine a point that I'm going to make later, there is kind of a multi-level selection. There is a multi-level selection flavor to what I'm trying to sell here. Except the groups that I'm creating aren't like groups in the same, say, physical location. They're groups at the same life stage. But I mean, in multi-level decomposition, I can draw my circles however I want. The good thing about multi-level decomposition, and maybe a bad thing. Okay, I can't help myself. I want to draw an analogy here between allocating reproductive success in a pizza. Okay, and if you've ever back in my student days, we didn't always have enough money for multiple pizzas. We'd have to split a pizza, and that would mean that, some of us would want pizza with pepperoni, others would want, say, anchovies. And I guess the lesson here is kind of the lesson that you would maybe learn as an undergraduate with not so many dollars in your pocket. If you, as a anchovy loving individual, take a bigger slice of the anchovy piece, then you're only affecting other anchovy lovers. You're not affecting the pepperoni lovers, right? If you take a smaller than average slice and you're a pepperoni pepperoni lover, then you are only benefiting other pepperoni lovers. We leaned heavily into this analogy, Tom and I, in our proceedings. So in our paper, so heavily that I managed to convince Tom to submit my photo of a pizza that I made at home for cover art. And they didn't go for it, unfortunately. But we had to try, right? We had to try. So just to summarize, let me just lay out for you in a bit more detail what it is I'm advocating for here. If you want to just go right to a mathematical model for inclusive fitness without an intervening neighbor modulated fitness argument. So we have to establish how reproductive value is earmarked for each category or class of individual. And that establishment comes from the demographic assumptions you want to make about your population. You then have to describe how the primary social interaction changes the reproductive value of both actors and recipients. I would suggest that so reproductive value is implying here, I'm talking about relative fitness, okay? Not absolute fitness, relative fitness. Then you use life cycle details that you would have worked out already as part of your modeling exercise to determine how the compensation occurs secondarily. So secondary to whatever primary interaction you had. Who gets pushed out? Who has more space opened up and can kind of step into a void? And finally, you can combine all of these facts into what I would call a narrative that exposes the logic behind an actor's decision, the logic behind an individual's inclusive fitness that would, I guess, in turn expose the logic that would govern why an individual would be willing to engage in what might otherwise seem to be a weird decision. Okay, so what have I done so far? Time's winding down, but I still think I've got time to talk about number 3. We've defined inclusive fitness. We've talked about conservation of reproductive value, at least as a modeling tool. I want to provide you with some closing thoughts. And these are all the things I just couldn't seem to kind of drop in numbers 1 and 2, and a little bit of, like I said, editorializing at the end. One thing that I haven't had a chance to mention is that the costs and benefits, the C's and the B's, may not actually be constant. I've been maybe explaining them to you as if they were, but they needn't be. So I could have inclusive fitness that depends on the average trait value, Z or Z, if you're one of my neighbors, Z. And how you would go about using such an expression is basically the same way I was using expressions a moment ago. We would compare inclusive fitness to W bar, the average reproductive success, and end up studying an inclusive fitness effect that depends on Z bar. You would maybe make predictions about an evolutionarily stable level or a stable level of trait by setting that difference, so just these terms here, equal to 0, and solving for Z bar. Very analogous to the way in which folks use evolutionary game theory to study fitness functions. Oh, that's just what I said. And in using, if you go down, you will go down this road. For example, if you're using inclusive fitness to study sex ratio evolution, parasite virulence, dispersal, any number of traits. Okay? I totally swept this under the rug, but I was assuming, in order to pull all this off, I assumed that alleles that underlie a behavior combine additively to create phenotypes. Again, I don't think that's necessarily an earth-shattering revelation. We saw, I think, the importance of that in the previous talk. What it does afford us, or what it does ensure, is that we can use inclusive fitness to gain insights, or maybe I'll say it this way: the insights we gain by studying inclusive fitness are, when we have this assumption, the same as the insights we would get by studying fixation probability. If you're a population geneticist and you want to study fixation probability and compare the fixation probability of an allele to, say, its fixation probability were it neutral, then you'll arrive at the same conclusions. You will arrive at the same conclusions using an inclusive fitness analysis as you would if you were someone who focused on adaptive dynamics and you wanted to study the invasion fitness of a rare allele. You can't, with inclusive fitness, you can't generally get evidence, concrete evidence that a particular trait is evolutionarily stable with inclusive fitness all the time, but you can get the same, you can make the same qualitative predictions at least. Okay. And inclusive fitness, I think this was a point that was brought up in the previous talk. Inclusive fitness predictions agree with those based on a multi-level selection decomposition of a multi-level decomposition of selection. And they're just, if we can trace these arguments both back to the price equation, and I think it would be a terrible thing if somehow one covariance decomposition gave us an answer that disagreed with a different kind of covariance decomposition. Oh, what did I do? Oh, no, I'm going backwards. And this is my last slide. This is where the editorializing comes in a little bit. Um, so if they're, I think if now that I've said that they're mathematically the same, then why bother? I'm not the only one. You're not the only one who's asking why bother. Why would we bother with inclusive fitness if we can get the same mathematical answers with, say, something like a multi-level selection decomposition? Well, I will argue or offer to the group that it's only inclusive fitness that addresses the paradoxical nature of social traits like altruism. Right? Why would an individual be willing to pay a fitness cost to provide a benefit to another individual? I think I will argue that only inclusive fitness lays bare that the logic behind that. Yes, it's true that you can create a multi-level selection decomposition that says, oh well, if I've got altruism, then the within group selection is outweighed by the among group selection. But that's true, but what that observation doesn't do for me anyway is explain, well, why would I still not want to kind of cheat on that balance and get more success flowing my way? To me, it kind of skirts the issue. I think I could probably make the same argument or the same criticism against relying only on the neighbor modulated fitness approach. That yeah, it's true that if I'm an altruist, there's some statistical probability that if I'm also hanging around Manus, that Manus is also an altruist, but it doesn't quite explain to me why there wouldn't be some defection on Manus's part. And so it seems at least there's a conceptual incompleteness to some of these that I don't feel is present in inclusive fitness and inclusive fitness arguments. And I guess another way of saying what I'm trying to say is that it's only inclusive fitness for me that emphasizes agency, that emphasizes why a particular individual would desire to do the things that it is doing. And I'll leave you maybe with the thought that that's particularly useful when we're thinking about conflict, because I think conflict and studying internal conflicts, they benefit from that sense of agency. Okay. It's inclusive fitness, I guess, that really traces back or makes the connection between the kind of, convivial interactions that you see there and the sharpness of the great white shark teeth. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. I will thank the organizers again for the generous invitation, the amazing surroundings, and I guess I could turn it over to questions. I'll run around with the microphone. I hit it.
Oh, thanks. That was wonderful. I was thinking about the example where you had the juveniles and the first years and the adults, and
that one.
Yes, but you had the one with the pie slices.
I had the pie slices.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go back to that. Keep asking questions.
That's fine. I'll
just go back to it.
So the idea that if a juvenile does something so costly there, let's say it dies, and then there's you presented that this gives the other juveniles more chances to kind of like fill the slices.
They could be. I mean, I'm not committing myself to a particular scenario, but we could I could imagine there's some massive.
I think it was one of your examples. And so my question is, how sharply defined are these black boundaries? Because to come back to your favorite organism, the sharks, it could be that the juveniles are in some sort of nursery habitat, and therefore it sounds like density regulation plays a role, that they get more survival points each if one of them is dead. But it could be that in some other fish species, all the juveniles and adults eat the same thing in some shared habitat, and then the fixedness of the black boundary doesn't seem to be because you presented it as a mathematical argument that you normalize within the stages. But in some, to me, it seems to be that the biology of the system can make that assumption. You need to do it this way or that way, depending on.
Okay, so I think I've lost track of what your question is. But
all right,
are you saying that you're having a hard time accepting that these are fixed?
Exactly, that's my question.
Okay, so they're fixed at least for a generation. So the way I think about this is as a Markov chain determined by what I'm assuming over here. And I admit that I'm not giving you all the mathematical details, but if you could imagine, or at least be willing to allow me to say we could imagine that for a moment, I could understand how the lines of descent are traced. I mean, in such a way that it may not actually be generations from now, but at least in this moment, if things were to remain exactly the way they are now, that this is how alleles would be traced. Well, I'm going backwards in time in my mind, but I've got time reversible Markov chains, so probabilistically they're the same forward in time. That if in that moment, these are the divisions we get. In the next generation, I may have to redraw those lines again based on how things work out. I think what I'm saying here is a version of selection has no foresight. So selection can only act on sort of the situation right now. That situation may change. If a comet comes down, then the situation and hits the Earth, and the situation's going to have to change. I'm going to have to really adjust these lines. I think that's maybe where we have a disconnect.
Let's talk about it over lunch. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sure.
Thanks. Thanks for a great talk. I want to go back to your sort of final closing thought and maybe ask something slightly philosophical. So and actually Arvid and I were chatting about something like this group meeting a few weeks ago. If you have two models that are sort of, you can map to the same maths, but they represent different stuff. This idea of agency and whatnot is what's really so I think a lot about unicellular systems, which I don't think have agency, or sort of free will even. And so I'm wondering, when do you think about using which model system? And you've mentioned that the benefit here is that this one lays bare, like you have a parameter that is sort of agency almost, or like altruism as a concept is something you do on purpose, which could be reflected mathematically in something that a bacterium does mathematically, but it's not that something a bacterium's doing.
So how do I resolve that?
How do you resolve it, or how do you think about choice of system / the words you use to describe a system, and then when you challenge it with data, like if I'm trying to challenge a mathematical system like this with data from single-celled organisms, and I've seen 1,000 papers out there that are like altruism in this system. Okay. How do you think about mapping from things that clearly have no free will or agency to concepts, mathematical concepts buried in parameters that reflect that? I
guess I don't. Well, first of all, I don't always challenge stuff that I do with data. So, I mean, you ask me why, I just don't.
Nothing ruins
theory.
Me,
right? Shame on me. Fair enough. I've said agency here, and I guess maybe what I should have said is like an analogy to agency. So I find it very powerful to imagine or to ascribe some agency to a bacterium, even if it doesn't have that agency. Just the same way as I find it useful to think about what the shark is trying to accomplish. I don't imagine that the shark is like willing its teeth to become sharper, right? And so, but yet I still feel like I can ascribe some agency to it, at least in the context of the traits that it's displaying. So I guess I mean, the vulgar answer to your question is I don't worry about it. Yeah. And I think in terms of analogies.
Fair enough. I think depending on, I guess the I don't know where to go with that. I think I'm concerned if my scientific goals, if my scientific goals involve getting control of or understanding the evolutionary outcome within some population, either of organisms or disease-causing organisms, which is what I think a lot about. I do sort of worry about each of those parameters and whether they're modifiable or perturbable. Yeah. And therefore, I guess that's where I just get more concerned. But
I take all I can do is accept your point. I definitely accept your point, and clearly, like I need to reevaluate.
No, not at all. I think it's not about reevaluating. It's about my question is sort of when do you choose which model system if they're if they do map to one another, like, so if you have like a Volterra versus a replicator, they are mathematically mappable, but they say different stuff, right? And so when do you choose inclusive fitness versus non?
I mean, I just get a kick out of laying bare the logic, and I love imagining an individual trying to do something. And so I guess my default is always to go there. When I was still trying, if I'm trying to explain to a population geneticist why this stuff makes sense, I will often revert to something that's a bit more recipient centered.
Got it. Yeah, I guess it's sort of just about like, obviously, not obviously, but when you think about human populations or ones that clearly do have agency, and then you sort of strip down to the other extreme where you have something that clearly doesn't, it's that sort of reasoning slider bar, if you will, makes me think about.
Yeah, and I think I maintain that it's a super powerful analogy. Like when I get sick, I imagine what my immune system is trying to. I mean, I guess that's still me, but I think I imagine these things like going around and, you know, goal seeking, exhibiting some goal seeking behavior, and I just find that helpful.
And I just wanted to say also the idea of conservation laws is fascinating, and I'm going to just read about it because I'm new, but I love that. I love that concept.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers.
All right. So I just have two things. First is grammatical. It's weighted, not weighed, just based on
it is weighted.
It is weighted because to weigh is to measure, and then to weight is to to actually put a load on something to make it sink down.
Okay.
So
gotcha.
Weighted average and all of that. Okay. So yeah, right. Well, and then I did actually want to follow up on Jake's point.
Okay.
And I think we actually probably have very similar thoughts. But one of the things that I'm thinking about, especially with regard to the last point, is different mechanistic processes leading to the same statistical patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if maybe that's what inclusive fitness brings in versus a kind of, price equation, kind of, positive assortment, right? Because there's many ways to get positive assortment, right? And you could have, say, reciprocal altruism or kin selection or something of that sort. And I mean, I guess another way I think about it is, when I think about sociality, right? You can have this one thing that you call sociality, but when you look at social organisms all across the globe, there's so many different varieties of what it means to be social. And then on top of that, there's so many different mechanisms that actually lead to that kind of sociality, right? So I wonder if measuring the end goal or the result of whatever the thing is can lead to a convergence, even if it's not the same process. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I maybe I'll throw another log on that fire, and the log would, I guess, be that we would have to be careful if we're going to probe mechanism, that we make sure how we want to define what's proximate and what's ultimate here. Like I grew up with sex ratio, and so like there's a mechanism there, like a sex chromosome that leads to a result that there's some value in thinking at sort of a longer term, like why would that particular mechanism have evolved? You're standing. Does that mean? Yeah. Okay.
I would have let it go longer, but you put pizza up there and we're heading to lunch, and I can't let it go any longer than this. Thank you, Geoff.